Christmas book challenge. Welcome! In this video, I'm going to talk about my enormous passion for reading, how I acquired it as a habit at the age of 12 and how it changed my life. I will also tell you how I managed to read 100 books for the first time at the age of 16 and still have a normal, well, in my understanding, normal life of a teenager, having other experiences apart from devouring books. First of all, why 100? It's a pretty number and a challenging one, but not unrealistic. I'm convinced that if you do something 100 times, you will become a pro. If you shoot 100 videos or films, how will you not get good at it? If you drive your first 100 miles, you will become a confident driver. Or knit your first 100 scarves, you'll get good at it. So yes, in a way, that number does give you some sort of assurance, sense of accomplishment. It is challenging enough to make you push yourself hard, but it's not challenging enough to kill you, like reading 500 or 1,000 books a year. Although, if you read 100 books every year, in 10 years you'll be somewhere around 1,000 books. It all started with this notebook here that I showed in my previous video. It says, "Here you will begin to dream." It's kind of prophetic. This one is from Russia, and I'm Armenian from Russia, in case you are wondering about my exotic accent. I've been living in the US for the past 5 years. So naturally, most of the books I read in my life were in Russian or Armenian, although I always did try to read classical American and English literature in the original, or I would read the original and the translation to understand better. So yeah, it all started here. I remember it was New Year's Eve. I was 12. I was sick with the flu and bored, and I just decided to write down all the books that I would read in the next year. I didn't know back then where it would lead me, how it would change my life, but I was curious to know how many books a year I can possibly read. Now, I have to say, I wasn't much of a reader back then. I liked reading, but only the books of my choice, and my taste was not great back then. I only liked some teen detective stories, and of course I had to do my homework, read whatever was required at school. I was an A student, but it was kind of an easy A. And then this happened. A new teacher of Russian and literature made an appearance at school. She was terrifying. She was the strictest teacher I've ever had. But she was also kind of cool. And from an A student, I was kicked down to be a C student in a course of a month. So I said to myself, I have to do something about it. I can't just sit with a dictionary and learn the spelling of every single Russian word. I know some people would do that. That wasn't me. I didn't have patience for that and still don't have. But my dad and my grandpa once told me that reading improves your language skills. So again, being a bored, depressed C student, a teenager during the holidays, I just decided to pick up the first biggest thing that I saw on my shelf, and that happened to be Count Monte Cristo, a 2-volume novel of Alexandre Dumas. And what do we see here? The very first book, Count Monte Cristo. First 40 to 50 pages didn't really go well. I got very tired and it was a little bit too heavy. Then something happened. It's really hard to explain, but I just realized that if I didn't get to the end, I would never know what happens to Edmond Dantes and Mercedes. And that very thought was just so painful that I just kept reading without any rest. I fell asleep with that book, I woke up reading it, and just like that, in 2 days, the 2-volume novel was devoured. My big bow to Monsieur Dumas for making me addicted to his novel. After that, I couldn't really stop, especially with Dumas and the French. After years of reading, fairy tales, cute little stories that were required at school that I didn't really like, or teen detectives, I jumped into a grown-up world of classics. Since no one really controlled what I read, I could jump from Dumas to Maupassant or Chateaubriand, or from Gogol to Nabokov's Lolita, just like that. And my parents were just super happy that I'm reading. They didn't really check what I was reading. And what's really interesting, my language skills went through such a dramatic improvement. I started to use fancy words and expressions, beautiful allegories and metaphors, without even trying too hard. Because my vocabulary grew broader, richer, I even acquired a sense of humor that I didn't notice before in myself. I wouldn't say, of course, it was as bright as some of my classmates had, but they were born with it. But it was there. It was alive. My language was alive. And the more I improved and developed my vocabulary, the more stories I read, the more characters' arcs I went through, the better I understood the world around me and other people, which is so important. My personality started to develop in the way I didn't expect. I acquired a particular taste in art, music, literature, even people. And that taste, of course, was changing over time. But it did give me a certain standard of what I want to surround myself with. And reading also gave me this live and learn type of mentality that helps me to go through life with a certain optimism and cheerfulness. No matter how much you read, there's no bottom in that well of knowledge. Therefore, life is sweet and a constant discovery. And it took me a year or so, but my C in Russian gradually became a B, and then I started to get A's. And I became one of the top students in the literature class. My biggest passion for Russian classics started approximately the same time that I started to really read and understand Pushkin, Lermontov, Tyutchev, and the Silver Age poets. And I have to mention my idols, Tolstoy, Turgenev, Chekhov, and of course Dostoevsky, who became my invisible, ever-present, glorious companion. I still can't get enough of him. Another very important thing that happened within those years was that I started to realize what I want to do with my life. Since my early childhood, I was quite a storyteller. I would invent and produce plays and construct a little cardboard theaters with my mom. Until I went to school, I had a pretty lonely, boring childhood, so I learned to entertain myself. And if some guest accidentally entered my room, I would take them to the corner and strangle them with my doll theater dramas and tragedies until they beg for mercy. And then being a teenager and having access to a much deeper, more profound and complex literature gave me an idea that there was so much more to tell. It still took me about 10 years or so to figure out that I wanted to be a filmmaker, but I did get the track right. I became a journalist first, so by that time I already knew that I wanted to tell stories. Also, the exercise of reading the stories and then repeating them to myself or others really expanded my worldview. I mean, at the age of 12, 13, not many teenagers have their own acquired life experience. I had some, but books jam-packed with substance definitely added to that experience. While reading, I was living the characters' lives. I was understanding their deepest motivations and impulses. And of course, it helped me to understand people around me better. Dostoevsky was especially a great help in that quest. A book-loving teenager is not something weird or uncommon, especially in Moscow, where everyone reads in the subway on their way to work or school. I guess I was a little bit of a nerd, but people didn't perceive me that way, not really. I had many other interests than studies and books. I was always trying new hobbies. I started to play tennis, sing in the choir, dance flamenco. What I think allowed me to read a lot, but also meet with friends and have occasional dates and live a normal life were two facts. First of all, I loved reading, and that was more of a pleasure for me than work. Secondly, I never really liked wasting my time on things that didn't benefit me in any way, like playing video games for hours or chatting on the phone, no social media back then, or browsing through internet just for the sake of browsing. I did all of that, of course, but in moderation. For instance, if I spent more than 3 hours playing a video game, I would compensate the next day by reading more or doing something productive like cleaning or decluttering my room for the same time or even more. That way I was able to let myself have fun but also be responsible for my time. And again, it didn't always work, but most of the time I was able to find balance between work and leisure. And that simple habit of making myself accountable for my time led to a huge improvement in the quality of my life. And then at the age of 16, I just decided that I have to read 100 books in a single year. It was fully my decision. I didn't know anyone making challenges like that. I just looked at all the books that I read since I was 12 and figured that with a little push, I could get to 100. And I was not going to share that information with anyone. I would never think that I would show to anyone this notebook. So I just did it for myself to test my limits. So the year went by pretty smoothly with some ups and downs in reading, but I remember it was already November and I got to only 85 books and I had like 15 books left and I started to panic. So I cheated a little bit. I started to read collections of poetry and plays to get to 100 faster. I wouldn't say it was such a big deal because look, throughout the same year, I went through Boccaccio and Middlemarch of George Eliot, which I think was a pretty thick book, and and 4 volumes of War and Peace. So yeah, this was probably the first time I read that book. I read 2 more times afterwards, but what do you think? Was it a big deal? The result of winning this race was just so satisfying that a little bit cheating here and there was fine. I was still very unhappy with myself, very disappointed, so I pushed myself even harder the next year and I got to 100 even before December. And that was my second time reading 100 books in a single year. By the way, from there I acquired another habit of not leaving the book unfinished because every book counts in this challenge. Right now, since I have much less free time, I do occasionally give up some books if they're incredibly boring or shallow or just badly written. But when I was a teenager, I wouldn't do that. My philosophy back then was that even a low quality book would teach you something. I followed that logic and it worked for my life back then. And thanks to that habit, I'm not easily giving up on anything in my life. I'm super competitive even if I have to compete with myself from 2019 or 2020. And visualizing the progress, writing down every single book that I read in a journal or notebook was also very helpful. It kept me motivated to continue filling out more pages, more journals, go through more characters' arcs and more stories, discovering more plot lines and character dilemmas. Book journaling helps you to track how many books a year you read, but it also shows your taste and how it changes. It's even more productive to leave some notes or comments about these books. It keeps me in some sort of track of reading productivity. This list gives me a sense of what kind of person I was back then, what kind of books I preferred to others. It's nice to know, for instance, that I read much more contemporary literature in 2013 compared to 2012. This other journal is from the year 2020 when I also read 100 books. You can see here I marked with pluses and minuses the books that I really liked or hated. Analyzing the old and the new notebooks, I can see that the novel that I read at the age of 15 left a totally different impression on me at the age of 25. So yes, I'm very happy that I started this challenge early on in my life so I can see the progress throughout my adult life. So I encourage you to journal, to write down the books you read and leave tiny reviews if you have time. That makes you feel really productive and helps you to build confidence in your knowledge and skills. Now, I wanted to say that if you're challenging yourself to read 100 books in a single year, do not read 10 books at a time. Some people would recommend to do that. I do not recommend that at all. Of course, if you're just reading for the sake of reading or increasing your reading speed or just to brag to your friends that you read 100 books a year like I do, of course you can do that. But if you actually want to take something from these books and not confuse your brain, reading 10 books at a time is not a good idea. I would recommend to focus on 1, maximum 2 books at a time. I don't know how you guys, but I don't jump from entry to dessert, then back to the main dish, then back to the entry when I eat a 3-course meal. I would rather recommend read 30, 35 books a year, but make each one of them count. Your time is too precious to waste on mindless robotic reading. No man is born wise or learned. Reading takes time and effort, but every hour spent on mindful reading absolutely pays off. In my next video, I will tell you about the system that I invented at the age of 12 to better remember and understand books. I will talk more about my zeal for reading, my motivation to read every day, and how that simple habit changed so many aspects of my life. I will give you some tips on how to deal with procrastination that I'm not immune to at all. And I'll tell you how I got to 100 books for the second time without losing a beat. So stay with me. Thank you so much for your time. Please like and subscribe if this video was interesting or helpful. So see you very soon, and sweet readings to you all.